Shocking. Harsh mobilization in Russia. Total street raids and contracts signed through brutal beatings. Putin's army is desperately short of people. Million-ruble payouts aren't working, so now Russians are being caught on highways, blackmailed through their families and forced into local assaults. Even those who survived severe wounds and are literally riddled with shrapnel are being driven to the front. Why is the command openly mocking the soldiers? How are people turned into infantry in just 24 hours? And why are relatives starting an open revolt against the authorities? Watch all the shocking details of Putin's terror right now. Greetings, this is the Ukraine Today channel. I'm Andrei Silakov with the latest events. The Kremlin's war machine has begun to devour itself, faced with a total shortage of human resources. As noted by Western journalists from CNN and independent analysts, for the fifth month in a row, the Russian army's losses at the front significantly exceed the rate of recruitment of new occupiers. Astronomical cash payments and promises to write off loans no longer attract Russians. There are practically no fools left to die for the dictator's ambitions. Realizing the failure of voluntary recruitment, Putin's regime has switched to tactics of blatant street terror and forced mobilization.
In several Russian regions, reports are emerging of raids by military recruitment officers and police, document checks, and detentions of military-age men right on the streets. Eyewitnesses describe raids and people being forcibly taken to military recruitment offices.
Human rights activists are recording a fundamentally new, radical approach by the authorities to catching future stormtroopers. While previously men with debts or criminal records were persuaded to sign a contract during routine police visits, now real raids have begun in the regions. Security forces are setting up ambushes on roads and intercepting cars. They stop pedestrians on the streets and forcibly take them to military recruitment offices. Absolutely everyone is being taken to the front, including people in a state of severe alcohol intoxication.
Guys! Hey, tell me, did everyone sign the contract voluntarily?
Don't cry, just don't cry.
They forced you. Tell me, they forced you. They beat you. Voluntarily or not?
Just pray to God and please don't cry.
Don't leave them, please.
Yes, absolutely.
Don't leave them.
Yes, absolutely.
Please, if you would.
Close the door.
What, you really won't even give us just 5 minutes?
Can't you behave like a human being?
We'll behave normally.
Enough. Could you have done it humanely?
Humanely like this.
You're beating them. We definitely know you beat them.
How is that better then?
You're just really cursed scum, you know that.
Very soon, mobilization could affect every military-age man in Russia. The average lifespan of a Russian stormtrooper is about a week. For those who don't want to be Putin's cannon fodder, there's still a chance to save your life and leave the Russian Federation. Run while you still can. And for those who've already signed a contract, remember, surrendering is one of your few chances to survive.
Persuasion methods at recruitment offices have turned into criminal lawlessness. Relatives of those illegally mobilized are reporting widespread cases of torture. One Russian woman told journalists that bailiffs stopped her husband on the highway, but he ended up at the recruitment office where he was severely beaten and forced to sign a contract.
They beat him very badly. My husband would never have signed a contract in his life. He has a son from his first marriage. He reminded him every day, don't even think about signing a contract.
Another Russian man was given a choice. Either he goes to the slaughter voluntarily because of a 76,000 ruble credit card debt, or he goes to prison. They only beat a confession out of him after the security forces directly threatened physical violence against his wife and children.
The woman said her husband signed the documents only after they threatened to harm his family. They said, "If your wife takes this any further, your family will suffer," she noted.
Once in the hands of security forces, a person is stripped of all rights. It's getting absurd. To immediately sign the beaten man to a contract, recruitment officers print him a new passport right on the spot. And such haste is no accident. Because according to experts, the average lifespan of an untrained Russian stormtrooper on the Ukrainian front is now only about 1 week.
The day before yesterday he called and said they were already in Rostov, and yesterday he called and said they were in Mariupol, the Russian woman said.
But even those who survived this meat grinder, the system has no intention of letting go. A massive scandal is brewing online. The father of a Russian occupier who fought for 3 years recorded a desperate appeal to the command. His son, who survived a severe wound and has over 100 shrapnel fragments in his body, was tricked into returning to the front lines.
There are more than 100 fragments in his body. Even the surgeons found it hard to count how many there were. They found up to 100. And then they said there was no point in counting because the rest were very small. There are 60 fragments around his heart alone. His breastbone is broken, there's a hole. They just pulled the skin over, stitched it up, and that's it. His arm is full of pins. Right now, at the military unit, they said he has to go to Kursk for a medical commission. Supposedly, we don't have enough doctors in Ryazan, and so on and so forth. They deceitfully told him he was going to a hospital in Kursk. They put him on a bus, and after a brief wait, they sent him off to the dangerous combat zone.
Just like that, instead of the promised medical board, the crippled fighter was simply thrown back into the trenches. The unit commander responded to the father's outrage with a stream of profanity, to which the Russian man reasonably noted, "You didn't send your own children there."
Comrade Commander of the 137th Regiment, I gave you a healthy son, healthy. You returned him to me practically in pieces. Look, they put him back together in a hospital in Moscow. God bless those doctors with health, strength, and long life for saving him and putting him back together. So, when I questioned the unit commander, I was bluntly told to get lost. The unit commander, personally, when I went to see him, he told me, "Go to..." That was the conversation. I know, yes, you're there, but you're who knows how many kilometers away, sitting in headquarters. Why don't you sit with these boys in the trenches, be there when the drones strike? I'll see how you behave then. You didn't send your own children there, did you?
This is how Russia is rapidly turning into a massive trap for the male population, where any walk outside could end in a meat grinder assault. Russians are left with only two ways out. While there's still time, save your life and flee the country. Or, if you're at the front, immediately contact the Ukrainian I Want to Live project and surrender. Any other scenario, according to former Ukrainian MP Anton Gerashchenko, guarantees they'll return home in pieces in a black bag. And these Russian failures can no longer be hidden. While drones scorch Moscow and propaganda frantically changes its scripts, the Kremlin itself reeks of real panic. Now it's not Western experts, but Putin's own deputies who are openly shouting about upcoming riots and total corruption. How the dictator is rapidly losing control over his country and why the facade of boasted Russian stability is bursting at the seams, watch in our report.
Putin is already one step away from collapse. The scent of crisis is growing stronger in the Kremlin. Then this time, it's not the opposition sounding the alarm at all. Even in the Russian State Duma, it's becoming harder to hide the nervousness. Communist Party Deputy Vyacheslav Markayev openly accused the Kremlin of corruption and warned that Russia is nearing a massive social explosion. According to him, the time for illusions is over, and the responsibility for potential chaos will lie entirely with the current government. For a system where officials competed for years in loyalty to Putin, such statements sound like a very alarming signal from within. Even more interesting is that Markayev spoke directly about the risk of mass unrest and effectively admitted the situation in the country is becoming increasingly unstable. Another communist deputy, Renat Suleimanov, who previously called for ending the war as soon as possible, joined the criticism. It seems that even in political circles loyal to the Kremlin, an uncomfortable question is being asked more often. How much longer can Russia endure this war? Reasons for discontent are piling up. Mass internet outages, lack of tangible success at the front, economic problems, and regular Ukrainian drone strikes on the Russian rear are increasingly affecting the public mood. And while propaganda continues to talk about stability, even representatives of the system itself are starting to openly say that under the facade of Kremlin confidence, dangerous social tension is building up. And Kyiv, meanwhile, is adding fuel to the fire. Volodymyr Zelensky's publication of intelligence data on the internal situation in Russia was a real cold shower for Putin. The president stated that Ukrainian intelligence obtained documents about the real internal political situation in Russia. The very reports that land directly on Putin's desk? And even despite the tradition of Russian officials sugarcoating reality, the picture emerging there is quite grim.
We understand that Putin is rarely brought completely truthful information without embellishment. But even what he sees in the documents that reach him still allows for certain conclusions to be drawn.
According to intelligence, the level of Russians' dissatisfaction with Putin continues to grow and shows no signs of stabilizing even on the eve of the September elections. Moreover, support for the ruling party is gradually declining. And this creates a rather uncomfortable dilemma for the Kremlin. Either explain to voters why everything is getting worse, or once again, demonstrate miracles of electoral mathematics. No less alarming for Moscow is the growth of protest sentiments in the regions. While Russian propaganda talks about national unity, the authorities themselves seem to be carefully calculating where and when accumulated dissatisfaction might break through, especially considering that summer is still ahead with its economic problems, strikes on logistics, fuel difficulties, and Ukrainian drone attacks.
We believe that these reports do not yet account for potential events in June, July, and August, which cannot fail to further impact the situation in Russia.
And this is where the most interesting part begins. Ukraine no longer hides its intention to continue increasing pressure on Russia, military, economic, and diplomatic. This means that the most difficult months for the Kremlin may still lie ahead. After all, when the economy weakens, social problems accumulate, ratings drop, and drones arrive all at once, even the most powerful propaganda starts to fail.
Perfectly justified pressure on Russia for this war will continue and intensify. And not just our pressure. Consequently, by September, Putin will approach with even worse indicators.
This is a kind of public reminder. While Russian propaganda tries to convince the world of the regime's stability, Ukraine increasingly demonstrates a completely different image of the Kremlin, one that is losing control over events and is forced to constantly put out new crises. The last few months for Moscow have turned into a real streak of bad luck. Fuel problems in a country that for decades took pride in its status as an energy superpower. Strikes on logistics, attacks on strategic facilities, and constant failures in the information war. A rather sarcastic picture is emerging. The Kremlin still talks about its strength, but spends more and more time not on the offensive, but on dealing with the consequences of its own problems. Ukraine's main bet now is not just on destroying individual targets, but on maintaining a pace of strikes and challenges that Russia simply cannot adapt to in time. The longer the economic, budgetary, and social exhaustion continues, the weaker the Kremlin's ability to respond to new strikes becomes. And when the system starts to lag behind events, every new problem automatically generates several more following it. That's why, ahead of the G7 summit, NATO meetings, and a new sanctions package, Kyiv is pushing a simple message to Western partners. Russia no longer looks like a party that is in control of the situation. On the contrary, more and more signs indicate that the Kremlin's resources are being depleted faster than it can manage to hide it. And as we know, people are much more willing to invest in someone who can win than in someone trying to explain their problems with more propaganda tales. And the most unpleasant thing for Moscow is that problems are piling up from several sides at the same time. A new EU sanctions package, increased pressure on the shadow oil fleet, risks to energy revenues, and an increasingly active Ukrainian long-range strike campaign. If until recently the Kremlin sold the world the image of an impregnable fortress, today that image increasingly resembles a building facade where cracks are visible even from afar. And it seems Ukraine's main task now is not to let these cracks heal, but to turn them into a real collapse. Meanwhile, Moscow itself is literally losing its roof. The largest drone attack of the entire war turned into a real nightmare for the RF capital, a blazing oil refinery, transport paralysis, and total panic. While Putin's officials habitually lie that everything was shot down, Muscovites, against the backdrop of the fire, increasingly remind the authorities of the tales about Kyiv in 3 days. How our new long-range surprises broke through the vaunted air defense and why the myth of Russia's security has finally burned down. Watch. Why did they bomb us? Muscovites have lost their minds. The RF capital has experienced its worst nightmare of the entire war. What the Russian authorities are trying to present as another successful air defense operation increasingly resembles a chronicle of the systemic vulnerability of the Russian capital itself. According to official statements, nearly 200 drones were flying toward Moscow and the region. And if, to repel such an attack, roads must be closed, facilities shut down, and new fires extinguished, then an uncomfortable question arises. Is everything really under control? The Moscow oil refinery in Kapotnya was hit the hardest. The enterprise has come under attack for the second time in a week, and it happened exactly when the plant was just about to resume operations after the previous attack. While Russian officials report on hundreds of allegedly destroyed drones, one of the key fuel infrastructure facilities is burning again and making the news. In Moscow, there is total chaos, closed highways, traffic restrictions, fires in shopping centers, and nervous reports from officials. The capital, long portrayed as Russia's safest haven, now more and more feels like a city living under constant air raid sirens. The war that the Kremlin once promised would be fought far away is now hitting closer to home, right outside the windows of ordinary Russians. Following the drones, missiles were also launched at Moscow. Presumably, we're talking about the Bars. It's a high-speed, fixed-wing aircraft with a compact turbojet engine and a warhead weighing roughly 50 to 100 kilograms. This combination allows it to not only cover vast distances, but also to pose serious challenges for the enemy's air defense systems. The strike range is also quite surprising. According to reports, the Bars is capable of operating at a range of about 700 to 800 kilometers. In other words, it's a so-called middle strike weapon, a class of arms that can systematically hit warehouses, headquarters, oil depots, logistics hubs, and other key sites far behind the front lines. But the biggest blow to Moscow wasn't dealt by drones, it was dealt by reality. Following the drone attacks, Russian social media literally exploded with panic, sarcasm, and uncomfortable questions. And while propaganda once again touted successfully downed targets, Russians themselves suddenly began to recall things the Kremlin would rather they'd forgotten long ago. Particularly painful for Russian propaganda were the comments about the legendary Kiev in 3 days promise. Online users are openly mocking the grand promises made at the start of the war. After the latest explosions and fires in the capital, more and more Russians are asking a simple question. If everything is going according to plan, then why, in the 4th year of the war, are drones regularly visiting Moscow itself? Russians are genuinely surprised by the sheer number of Ukrainian drones. Where do they get so many drones if we've been told for years that all their factories, warehouses, and production sites were destroyed long ago? And indeed, when propaganda lives in its own fictional reality for too long, sooner or later it starts to contradict itself. Even the master of the Kremlin himself didn't escape the criticism. The bunker grandpa will see this fire. It was exactly these kinds of sarcastic questions that were aimed at Putin online. It seems more and more Russians are less concerned with official stats on downed drones and more with why explosions and fires are becoming a routine part of their lives. Meanwhile, Ukrainians are also keeping pace on the internet. The real star of the attack suddenly became the roof of a storage tank. After the strike on the Moscow refinery, one fuel tank suffered such a massive detonation that its top was literally blown high into the air. The footage instantly went viral on social media and was immediately turned into memes. Users poured all their creativity into dozens of clever jokes, from UFOs to a smoke cloud tipping its hat to the Ukrainian armed forces. There were also parodies of legendary viral images. Sometimes a single well-timed shot deals as much damage to Russian propaganda's reputation as the attack itself. Because while officials try to convince everyone that nothing serious happened, the internet has already turned the event into the day's top meme. The Russian capital now lives in a state of constant anxiety. Drones are hitting, refineries are burning, and transport is grinding to a halt. And official reports increasingly sound like an attempt to explain the unexplainable. The Kremlin talks about control, while Moscow sees smoke and blocked roads.
And the gap between these two realities is getting wider and wider. At the same time, Ukraine is tightening a steel noose in the south. Swarms of our drones are methodically wiping out enemy supplies, while the occupiers in Crimea have fallen into a real paranoia and are feverishly digging up beaches in anticipation of a sea landing. Exactly how Ukraine is turning Crimea into an isolated island, we're looking into right now. The Kremlin has begun cautiously preparing Russians for the failure of the SVO. What just yesterday was considered treason and surrender has suddenly begun to sound on the airwaves of Russian propagandists as a completely realistic scenario for the future. And this is a very alarming signal for Moscow. For years, Russians were told a fairy tale about an inevitable victory, the seizure of new territories, and the fulfillment of all set goals. But now even the most loyal voices of Kremlin propaganda are beginning to admit the obvious. Without new waves of mobilization and colossal sacrifices, Russia might simply fail to reach even those goals that it solemnly listed as its own achievements. It turns out to be a rather awkward situation. They've already declared the territories their own, but they haven't been able to reach them. The funniest thing is that the very same propagandists who until recently demanded fighting to the victorious end are now cautiously testing the waters for a completely different story. In the Russian information space, talk of freezing the war and stopping hostilities along the front line is appearing more and more often. That is about what was previously called an absolutely unacceptable option in Moscow. One gets the impression that the Kremlin's TV channels have received a new set of instructions. If before citizens were prepared for a great victory, now they are gradually being accustomed to the idea that unfulfilled goals are also a victory. Supposedly everything went according to plan, it's just that the plan itself suddenly changed a lot. And if this trend is indeed gaining momentum, then for the Kremlin it could be a dangerous signal. Because when propaganda starts explaining why defeat is actually a success, it means that somewhere behind the scenes they already understand perfectly well. Reality turned out to be much harsher than the television fairy tales. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian military is already nipping at the occupiers' heels. A real paranoia is beginning in Crimea. The Russians take the threat of a Ukrainian return to the peninsula so seriously that they are increasingly digging into the ground, building fortifications and preparing for scenarios that until recently they tried not to even mention.
The enemy sees this as a real threat. The Russians are reinforcing areas in Crimea vulnerable to amphibious landings, as they consider this quite likely.
For the Kremlin, the situation looks rather awkward. For years, Russian propaganda convinced the population that Crimea is supposedly forever under the full control of Moscow. But if everything is so calm, then why mine the coast, build new defensive lines, or feverishly prepare for possible surprises from the sea? It seems even the occupiers themselves don't really believe their own television stories. However, the Navy emphasizes that such operations are among the most complex in warfare and can only be carried out as part of a major offensive campaign.
If necessary, we will of course carry out any operation required to liberate Ukrainian Crimea.
His comparison of future challenges to the legendary landing on Omaha Beach during World War II was particularly telling. After all, the occupiers are already turning the Crimean coast into a continuous obstacle course. And the more effort they spend on these fortifications, the louder the main question becomes. If Crimea is truly Russian forever, then why is it being defended as if they are most afraid of losing it? Ukraine is tightening the logistical noose around occupied Crimea more and more. The Russian command risks facing a problem that cannot be solved by loud statements or more propaganda stories. Mikhailo Fedorov made a bold statement. Crimea is being isolated by drones. And in the very near future, Crimea will turn into an island. And this could lead to very unexpected consequences for the Russians. We are no longer talking about individual strikes, but about a systemic campaign that is gradually destroying the occupiers' military logistics. The most painful thing for Moscow is that drones are hitting not just specific targets, but the army's entire supply system. After all, any group of troops can only fight as long as it receives fuel, ammunition, equipment, and reinforcements. And when these routes start falling out of the game one by one, problems very quickly reach even the front line. The scale is particularly telling. According to the minister, in the first months of this year alone, several times more such drones were contracted than in the entire previous year. And this is only the beginning.
We have announced a logistical lockdown. A hell is beginning for the Russians that is very difficult to deal with. And we have this window of opportunity. Logistics are being cut off, Crimea is being isolated, and this is reflected in the east. There is a direct correlation between how much we hit logistics and how many assault actions occur on the front line.
In the Kremlin, this seems to have seriously affected everyone. After bold statements about the isolation of Crimea, the Russian leadership suddenly decided to publicly justify itself. Interestingly, Sergei Lavrov had to respond personally. It seems the topic turned out to be much more painful than Moscow would have liked. Commenting on Mikhailo Fedorov's words that Crimea could effectively turn into an island due to strikes on logistics, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry stated that he didn't quite understand exactly how they intended to do this. However, the very fact that such a reaction appeared already looks quite telling. After all, the Kremlin is usually in no hurry to comment on what it does not consider a serious threat. Lavrov's next statement sounded even more interesting. He assured that a solution is allegedly already being sought for the Ukrainian drones. Supposedly, there's an antidote for every drone. A perfectly logical question arises here. If the antidote is almost ready, then why do Russian warehouses, bases, airfields, and logistics routes continue to regularly make the news? It wouldn't be complete without the traditional Kremlin arrogance. In the end, Lavrov decided to get personal and stated that Fedorov is new to the position, so he still needs to settle in. Actually, it looks quite funny because while Moscow advises the Ukrainian minister to settle in, it's Russian officials who are increasingly forced to explain to their own citizens why explosions, fires, and logistics problems occur in places that just yesterday were considered absolutely safe. The more actively the Kremlin tries to mock the threat, the stronger the impression that it actually worries them seriously. They are understanding the unpleasant reality better and better. The war, which was planned to end in a matter of days, is gradually turning into a struggle for their own logistics, their own rear, and even for a sense of security in territories that just yesterday were called Russian forever. If this trend continues, then Moscow's main problem will no longer simply be how to win, but rather how to explain to Russians why the much-promised great victory is starting to look more and more with each passing month like an attempt to save whatever is left. Then what do you think about these events? Share your opinion in the comments, give it a like, and stay informed about the main things. There's more to come.